I wanted to share a few stories from this week about how you have blessed your community. We had a woman who had been her father's caregiver for 10 years. That was her whole life, was caring for her father, and he died unexpectedly. And in his dying, the family wasn't prepared for everything that was going to have to happen after that, because all their income was tied to some of his disability, and not all of it, but a lot of it. And they just needed some help. So through your generosity, we were able to help with his cremation and also help with rent just for March 1st. Because now they're going to be ready to, she already had plans of what she was going to do in preparation for this, so she's doing those things so that she can kind of move forward. But for the initial hardship of this loss, you were there, and you provided to help a family in a time of great need, and she did such a gift caregiving for as long as she did. And this is actually, we don't just give people money, we also tell them, this is a sign that God is near you. This is a sign that God is paying attention to your suffering. This is a sign that we're with you too. And we were at dinner last night, my wife and I. Not the people that we just helped, my wife and I were at dinner. And I got a call from, and I would rarely take a call from anyone during dinner, but a call from the young man that we helped put into rehab. And I go, I'm happy that you're calling. And he said, I just wanted to call and say thank you to you and the church. And he was talking, he's one of the younger people in this program. And I said, well, this is why we have to help as soon as we can, because the sooner you help someone, they don't get so far down the road, So the sooner we can help and support, the sooner we can bring people to wholeness. And he's so grateful for that. And he's feeling that healing that's happening, doing the deep work of healing. And the final thing I'll tell you is, Victoria Elementary up the street. This is the first time we've ever helped Newport Mesa School District, but they're right up the street. And because Robin's Nest works with them, Robin had sent out an email saying, there's a mom and 3 kids living in a car, and it wasn't a big car. And she wrote to us and another organization and said, can you help? And so I wrote back and said, yes, the church will help. And the other organization wrote back and said, no. And I said, wow, and I know we work with these people. I go, I'm kind of surprised that you'd say no on this one. But so we go over to a hotel on Newport Boulevard, and every day they're sleeping in their car. The kids aren't going to school necessarily because they're just trying to get through the day. And so we've put them up in a hotel for a couple of weeks, and the school district is working to get them into shelter. So it's sort of one of these team approach things. But a mom and her kids are off the streets because of you. They were literally sleeping in their car, and it was a little bit bigger than my car, which isn't enough for one person to sleep in, let alone 4. And the counselor called me Friday afternoon and said, I want to talk to you. And I thought, oh no, what happened? I always think the worst. I always say that to people when I go, I need to talk to you, and they go, oh no, what does he want? I do that too, I go, oh no, what does she want? And she goes, I don't want anything from you, but I want to tell you something. She said, I was praying, and I said, Father, you said if I asked, you would provide, and I'm asking you for this mom and her kids. And she goes, you all were the answer to my prayer. She goes, the Father blessed me because you said yes, and I said I believe you. But you saying yes confirmed her faith. And so I just wanted to let you know, just this week, a caregiver who was grieving the loss of her father, a mom and her kids who were sleeping in a car, that's all been changed because of you and your generosity. And it's just this constant work of God calling us and blessing us and providing and equipping for this. Well, a few years before Martin Luther posted his 95 Theses, probably 2 to 4 years, because it took 2 years to complete, Michelangelo did his statue of Moses. Has anyone ever seen that, the statue of Moses? If you've been to Rome, Gary's shaking his head, Sarah Linder. It's a very famous statue, Michelangelo finishes the statue of Moses, and it was going to be part of a much bigger project that didn't happen. And it's a statue that is so compelling that even centuries later, Sigmund Freud, the great psychoanalyst who sort of changed Western civilization with his thinking, he spent 3 weeks sitting in front of the statue, and he actually wrote a book about it, Michelangelo's Moses. And he was so captivated by it. It's a very powerful sculpture. If you haven't seen it, you can Google it, or you can fly to Rome, or whatever you're going to do. But one of the details about it that's a little unusual is Michelangelo gave Moses horns. Now, if you've seen, he has these little, almost like Greek satyr horns on the top of his head. And it goes back to a long tradition of trying to translate the word glorified from Hebrew into Latin. And the words have close enough connotations that people said, well, either he had like the glory of God, which is light, or he ended up with little horns, so they gave him horns. But in later art, those turn into light. So if you ever wonder why Moses has horns, it was because of this thing that Paul read. When he went up to Mount Sinai, something happened to him. And so whether it was, this is why so many Christian saints in art have halos or they're just emanating light. It's because when you go into God's presence, something happens, something changes about you. Now, Michelangelo could say that Moses had a set of horns, but we might, and I guess he can't carve light, so maybe that was his way of being able to represent this transformation. But on this Sunday of Transfiguration, the same thing that's true about Moses is the same thing that's true about you, which is when you are in God's presence, something about you will change. That's why we call it transfiguration, the figure of the face of Jesus, which changes. The Greek word for transfiguration is metamorphosis, so we could even talk about metamorphosizing in the Holy Spirit, as the choir sang to us about walking in the Spirit. It's why we even have on the back panel of one of our windows there etched a butterfly, the metamorphosis of the creature. We might even think of the tomb of Jesus as the great cocoon, whereby Jesus takes our death and turns it into new life. This is a Sunday that is dealing with the real possibility that human beings were made to shine the divine light. Now, that was something that had been lost, and it was something that God wants to restore. And when Moses comes down from the mountain and is emanating light, he even covers it, because the restoration is going to come in a different way, at least through Christian teaching, as we hear in St. Paul. It's going to come not through the law, but through Christ. Now, there are so many details about this story that are interesting, because Sigmund Freud even said, all right, when did Moses come down the mountain? What moment did Michelangelo capture? Because there's 3 times. If you don't know your Moses trivia, there are 3 times he went up to the top of Mount Sinai, and he stayed there for 40 days each time. So he went up the first time, and this is when God gave him the 10 Commandments and wrote them with the divine finger, it even says. And if you knew Father Mike, who went with us to Japan, and he's a Catholic priest up in Oregon, a fun guy, very outdoorsy guy, he would even talk about how you could read the 10 Commandments on both sides of the pen because God had almost etched through the stone, And then he talked about God writing our names on the divine palm and saying the same thing. You can see through the hand of God the name, and then comparing that to the hand of Jesus on the cross. Now, that was the first time God wrote the 10 Commandments. Moses came down. They see the golden calf. Moses shatters the 10 Commandments. Total catastrophe, probably one of the worst moments in the Bible. This is one of the moments where the people almost are destroyed before they even really begin. It's almost God going, you know what, Moses, why don't you and I just do this, and then these folks are out. No, they work through it. Moses goes up a second time. He gets the law that he writes now with his own hand. He brings it down. And this is the story that Paul just read. This is the second time he comes down. And this is the time after the golden calf. And this is the time he could have gone into God's presence and he could have come down with a fire to destroy, to punish, to do whatever. But instead, in the light of God's forgiveness, he becomes light, or he emanates light. It's like when we were little kids and we would joke about radiation, or even nuclear war, or Chernobyl, or whatever, because we grew up in the time of Chernobyl. And they'd say, oh, look at that, they're going to be glowing tonight. This idea that radiation would make us glow at night. This is what's happening. There's this almost holy radiation onto Moses that he now carries with him. And this is the idea that once God is near you, you will carry something in that light and spirit forward. And it's almost the opposite of this little light of mine, because in this case he does hide it not under a bushel but under a veil. And so there's this question of what happens when we unveil the light of Christ in the lives of God's people. Because it could have just been a one-off where they're like, well, that's weird, Moses did that, I'm glad the rest of us don't have to do that. And then we find out that this gift of light is for everyone to be remade in the image and likeness of God. So that image was distorted by sin and has now been restored by the grace of Christ. Now we have this very famous story then where they go up onto Mount Tabor, so another one of the famous mountains. So you have Mount Sinai, then you have Mount Tabor, and Jesus is metamorphosized in the presence of his disciples, or transfigured. His face changes, his clothes change. They begin to see things clearly. And they see Moses and they see Elijah. And you'll remember Elijah was also on Mount Sinai, called Mount Horeb. It has two different names, sort of like battles of the Civil War, each having two different names. And so on Mount Horeb, he sees the divine. And there's a real argument that both Elijah and Moses, as they stand on that holy mountain, actually get to see the fullness of redemption, which will be this moment where they meet Christ in time, sort of this wormhole of this fabric of space-time, where they get to see God's redemption and the source of this light being Christ himself. And Peter has this moment where he says, shall we build booths? Shall we build booths? And he remembers that at the harvest time, they would build booths, which is very much when all this Mount Sinai stuff happened with Moses. They would build booths and dwell there, which is why Jewish people still do the festival of Sukkot. You know, they build their shelters. And this idea of it's time for the harvest. It's time for God to come and do something. It's time for God to do something wonderful. And Jesus doesn't allow him to build those dwellings because the work isn't going to happen on Mount Sinai or Mount Tabor. It's going to happen on the mountain of Calvary, the mountain of the cross. We see that the work is more than just making people glow. The work is taking the source of death and sadness and oppression inside of them, removing it and dealing with it so that the tomb can be a place of metamorphosis and not just a place of decomposition. This is why I think it's very important when they come down off the mountain, one of the very first things they do is they deal with a very hard possession case. You know, so it's not like they come down the mountain and they go, wow, that was really cool, and they're showing people pictures going, yeah, look at his face, it was glowing, and then someone comes and says, we need help, sorry, we're dwelling, and we just went on vacation and had a great trip, you know, don't kill our vibe, that kind of thing. Instead, they go right into an almost intractable case where this person has an illness, and the demonic is using this illness as an instrument to oppress, and no one can do anything about it. So again, it's like, well, that's great if Moses can glow. That's great if Jesus can glow. But what about this kid? This kid's just trying to stay out of the fire. And that's the same thing sometimes when we work with some of these families. It's like, oh, well, that's really great if you all want to do this or that. This kid's just trying to fall asleep in a car tonight. You know, Friday was Read Across America, so we go and we read. And my wife and I had a little dispute. It wasn't really a dispute. She has better taste than I do, which is probably not a surprise for you to hear. And whenever they do Read Across America, they always say, like, oh, bring Dr. Seuss, do this, do that. And I always bring something dark, you know, like Shakespeare, like a thing from Shakespeare, or this time a Japanese poem about suffering. And because there's this great Japanese poem about someone who's experienced the loss of a child. And it's a haiku, it's very short, and he's comparing his grief to bamboo in wintertime. And so the bamboo is standing, and then as it gets covered with snow, it starts to bend and bend until it's upside down. And then he says, the snow and the upside down bamboo, that's what describes his grief. And so I'd make the kids stand up in the classroom and then sort of be weighed down with sadness and be twisted by their sadness. But also tell them that the snow would melt and that there might be an opportunity for there to be a restoration. She goes, I don't know if she goes, that's pretty heavy for fifth graders, she said. I still did it. You know, I still did it, yeah. There's a great monologue from Richard II where King Richard knows that he's about to be beaten in battle because everyone's betrayed him to go over to Bolingbroke side, and he goes, let us talk of graves, of worms, of epitaphs, you know, let us with rainy eyes write sorrow on the bosom of the earth. So I made the fifth graders do that too. Go ahead, write sorrow on the bosom of the earth, go ahead, do it. They enjoyed it. But then one of the kids said, she goes, well, look what I got my teacher. And she got in her teacher a little skull, like a little skull planted with a cactus, and it said, Memento Mori. And I said, oh, these are my people. These morbid little fifth graders are my people. Perfect. But the reason, why was it important? Because I told them, I got invited here because I'm a chaplain with the police department, and we only ever go out to sad things. So we only ever go out to people who are bent over with grief, or bent over with sadness, or bent over by the power of death. And when Jesus and the disciples come down the mountain, they run into one of those families where it's like, it's nice that you're religious and it's nice that you're able to manage your stuff, but it doesn't seem it has any power over what our family's dealing which is this illness exacerbated by evil. And then they go, not even your disciples could help. And this is a moment, Jesus himself has just been on the mountain, and he says, how much longer do I have to put up with you people? Don't you understand? And then everyone looks at him going, no, we don't. He goes, I know you don't. That's the problem. I know you don't. That's the problem. And Jesus sets him free. And this is part of the point that the transformation we're talking about isn't just the transformation of glowing and light. It's God coming and freeing us from everything that is oppressive, everything that is the power of evil, everything that is the power of death. Jesus is going to set this child free on the way to the cross so that he himself can go into death itself to set us free and turn the grave into a place of metamorphosis, into the cocoon of new life. And that's why this Sunday of Transfiguration is so important, because it is a reminder to you, when you meet God, you will be changed. And the change will be life-giving. It will be more light, more healing, more hope. This is why Paul, in what Paul read, which is good why we had Paul reading Paul today, he says, degree by degree you will grow in glory. Degree by degree you will grow. So it'll be very quiet. Jesus, it happens in an instant, but to us, as we're living in the Spirit, as we're growing in faith, as we're practicing faith, as we do the Lenten work of prayer, fasting, and works of mercy, we will be growing degree by degree into the likeness of Christ, which means degree by degree the light is growing and getting bigger and going fuller. And with this counselor from Victoria Elementary, she was praying over the phone with me, and I was praying with her because we were celebrating what God was doing. And she said, I have a vision of just seeing God doing more and more with you all, meaning degree by degree the likeness of Christ will shine, that transfiguration will be here, and like Moses, we will unveil our faces so others can see the light of new life that comes from the resurrection of Christ. Amen.